The Financial Resources Scrutiny Forum held on the 1st of September 2022. Okay, so I can see that we have present Matthew Buchanan, Colin Dewar, Grant Ferguson, Ross Gowland, Gavin Keat. Do we have Richard Lockhart? No, I don't see Councillor Lockhart. I can see that we have Julia Mars. I have apologies from Monique McAdams. I have apologies from Carol Nugent. I can also see in the meeting that we have Shalene Handybode and Susan Kerr. Can I ask, is one of you substituting for Councillor McAdams? Councillor Handybode or Councillor Kerr, can you indicate? Sorry, but Councillor Handybode's here.
Hi there.
Hi there.
Yeah, I'm substituting.
Okay, so that's Councillor, sorry, was Councillor Handybode is substituting for Councillor McAdams. Councillor Kerr, are you just wishing to observe?
Just saying, only close off on McAdams.
Councillor Kerr, can you hear us? Councillor Kerr, are you able to hear us? I have activated your microphone.
Oh, hi, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yeah, I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Okay.
Do you wish to just observe the meeting?
No, I actually thought I was substituting for Councillor
McAdams.
I'm okay to leave the meeting then.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Councillor Kerr.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Okay, so if we can move on to the first. Sorry, I should also say we have various officers present this afternoon. If we move on to the first item of business, which is declaration of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest this afternoon? No. I'll just allow a minute in case any of the remote participants do. Okay, and no one has requested to speak. So item 2 on the agenda is the appointment of chair. As members will be aware, the terms of reference for Financial Resources Scrutiny Forum states that the chair must be an opposition member. With that in mind, can I ask for nominations for chair? Okay, I have Councillor Mars wishing to speak. Hi, Councillor Mars.
Thank you. I'd like to nominate Councillor Grant Ferguson for chair, please.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder for Councillor Ferguson? Councillor Dewar. Aye, Councillor Chair.
I'll second that.
Thank you. Do we have any other nominations? No, we have no other nominations for chair. So Councillor Ferguson will be appointed is now appointed as chair of Financial Resources Scrutiny Forum. Okay, if you bear with me, Councillor Ferguson, just one moment. I will send you the chair's note for this afternoon's meeting.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so that's the email now sent.
Just waiting for the email to come in.
Sorry.
You're still waiting for the
Waiting
email
for
to
it
come
coming
in?
through.
Yeah. Okay, that's been received.
Okay. Susan, do you want to hold off for a minute to try and get Councillor Lockhart into the meeting? Okay, Councillor Lockhart's just having one or two difficulties joining.
chair wants to go to an adjournment just to be good.
Okay,
Yeah, we can go to adjournment if Councillor Lockhart's having issues joining.
okay, so we adjourn for 5 minutes.
Perfect, thank you.
Now that I've got the screen up, Susan, I can't. Is he looking to speak? I can see him in the request, granting the request.
We're struggling here with the light, and you can see the. That's what I'm
okay.
seeing. Yeah, I think it's. So we're just waiting the adjournments to allow Councillor to join.
5-minute adjournment to allow Councillor to join.
And then when he joins, we just then carry on, is that correct?
Yeah, once he joins, I'll take the screen back down and
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. That is Councillor Lockhart now in the meeting with us. Okay, Councillor Ferguson. Okay, Councillor Ferguson, do you want me to hand over to yourself?
Just give me 1 second, I'm just getting a bit of a black screen here, so.
Okay.
Okay, we've got a better picture now, thank you. Apologies for that.
Okay, I've now activated
So,
Councillor
thank
Ferguson's
you.
microphone.
So thank you very much. Thank you for nominating me, and I would like to welcome everybody here today. And I would like to nominate the Deputy Chair as Julia Mars.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other nominations? Sorry, do we have a seconder for the nomination for Councillor Mars? Councillor Dewar?
Yeah, I'll second Julia.
Thank you. Do we have any other nominations at all for Deputy Chair? No, I don't see anyone else at all requesting to speak. So Councillor Mars is now appointed as Deputy Chair of Financial Resources Scrutiny Forum.
I might actually, can I just, sorry to interrupt here, I'm having a struggle with Teams, it keeps freezing here. If I can actually just take the video feed from there, it looks a lot smoother for me, if that's all right.
Okay.
I'm asking him to carry on Confero because I can actually be able to take him from there. So I think because the Wi-Fi is freezing on my screen here, so apologies for that. There you go. Okay, I would like to just congratulate Julia Mars for being deputy. Thank you very much. And so the next item for monitoring is item number 4, is it? Yep, is the revenue budget monitoring for 2022 to 2023, finance and corporate resources. And that's pages 5 to 12. So, have I gone? Oh, thank you. Yep. So, can I pass over to, is it Jackie Taylor, to lead through this, please?
Afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I would like to start just before I go into this paper in detail. I do appreciate there is quite a lengthy agenda for this meeting today. I can give you some comfort that The papers are not always this length. This particular meeting of the forum covers 2 financial years. So we close off last financial year and we start to report on the new financial year. So whilst it looks like there's a fair bit of detail in here, this isn't always the case. I can give you some comfort on that. The papers are split into 2 parts. There are capital papers, which we cover first in the agenda, and then we'll move on to our revenue budget. And I appreciate a fair number of us today are new to this forum. So for this particular meeting, we'll try and go into as much detail as we have to around the different elements of the budget that we're covering here. With your permission, I'm not going to focus too much in terms of the detail on the old year. We will cover the reports and obviously give opportunity to ask questions. All of this information has been presented to previous committees, be it executive committee or resource committees, but hopefully you've had a chance to read the papers, and if there are any particular issues that you want to raise or question, we can take them on board. Okay, if I go into the paper proper now. So on page 5, we have the capital budget monitoring for 21-22. So this is an old year paper. It's closing off 21-22 and it relates to our general fund capital programme. This is the capital programme. Capital spend is not day-to-day spend. It's not spend on employee costs or running costs of facilities, for example. It's on spend to improve and enhance assets. We have a paper that we'll cover in a second that covers our housing capital programme. We have a separate account for spend that is in relation to council houses. We have a housing revenue account and a council capital housing programme as well, but we'll cover those in a second. So in terms of this paper, which starts on page 5, we have a summary of the final outturn of spend for the year at section 4. And what that does is give a good brief summary of the programme for last year, which was £72.7 million of projected capital spend. And we report that of that we spent £61.5 million. Now that was an underspend of just over £11.1 million. And you can see there in sections 4.2 and over into 4.3 the reasons that underspend took place. That was predominantly due to the timing of when projects incurred spend. And the beauty of capital is that we will carry that unspent money into the new financial year to allow those projects to conclude. If I take us over to page 6, you can see there at section 4.5 there is a paragraph that covers year-end accounting adjustments. What we're required to do in terms of our accounting in our annual accounts, we have to make sure that we are accounting for spend in the right place. And inevitably, through the year, there might be some spend that we make from our capital programme that technically should be covered under our revenue budget and vice versa. So those paragraphs simply refer to some accounting adjustments we have to do at the end of the year. And section 4.7 is entitled Carry Forward into 2022-23. That's in relation to that unspent money from last year's capital programme that we will carry forward into the new financial year. And you'll see that again in the papers that cover the current financial year. That's the main body of the report. I'll give you a quick run through the appendices that you'll see in this paper, and this will be the format that you'll see for future reports for capital. On page 8, in Appendix A, we have the details of our capital programme over resources and over services. So it's quite a detailed table you can see there, but probably the column that I would draw your attention to is the right-hand column, which covers the actual spend that we've made against those services last year. And you can see down at the bottom right-hand corner, the total spend of £61.5 million. On page 9 of the report, you can see how we fund our capital programme. So the second part of that table covers the income that funds our capital programme. And there are a number of figures included there, but the main ones that contribute towards the funding for our capital programme is the top line, which is called prudential borrowing. Now, that is borrowing that the council takes. We can only borrow for capital expenditure. And the word prudential is included in there only because of the guidance that allows councils to borrow. It's called the prudential framework, and that means we can go and borrow prudentially. All that means is that we're comfortable that we can afford that borrowing. The other main line of funding on that table is in relation to capital grant that comes from the Scottish Government, and you can see that £24 million of the funding for our capital programme was from that source. There's also a number of other sources of government funding as well that you can see there. If I take you over to page 10 and 11 of the report, Appendix B covers the projects that are carrying forward into the new year. So you can see a range of projects there and the type of spend that relates to, be it infrastructure spend or be it refurbishment spend. A number of projects there that will conclude into the new financial year. So that's a summary of that report. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I've just got just a one question. With the Appendix B that you have there, I think it says, it mentions that the project types are different. You've got the different range of project types, and there's a part that says the Cathkin bypass. With regards to the Cathkin bypass, there's a part there which was. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about that Cathkin bypass? I think I understand everything else, but I think there's a little bit there that I don't quite get.
Thanks for that. Yeah, absolutely. That's under, we've called project type compensation only. The reason that we've put that narrative in is to differentiate between that particular project was the building of a road, but the payments that are still to be made from that project are actually in relation to compensation payments to residents surrounding that road. There is an opportunity under certain measures that there might be some compensation that those residents are entitled to in relation to, I believe it will be to do with noise. So that process is underway just now, where anybody that feels that they are eligible for that payment would apply and they would receive that money. That's the outstanding part of the spend rather than the actual building of the road. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That clarifies
Great.
that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next I have Councillor Keat.
Hi there. You know good?
Yes.
I don't have any specific questions about that agenda item. I just wanted to thank the officer for the manner in which she went through and explained that agenda item and out of this forum and the concepts that will be discussed in the forum. So I just wanted to thank the officer for put on the record that it was very clear for somebody new coming into this forum about how this type of thing works. It was very much appreciated.
Thanks very much for that. I did make a bit of an error. I didn't introduce myself. I do apologise. I'm Jackie Taylor. I'm the Head of Finance. So I'm Jackie, and my colleague here is Lorraine O'Hagan. She's going to assist in some of these papers later on. But thanks for your comments. I appreciate that.
So, is it? Do we all agree with the report? Oh.
Councillor Lockhart, if you want to go ahead. Councillor Lockhart, your microphone is now activated.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thank you.
All right. Did you get what I said?
No, we didn't.
Okay, right, Jackie, it was just a quick question. That last page you referred to,
Sorry, Councillor Lockhart, we lost you there for a minute. Can you repeat what you were saying?
right, okay, are you hearing me now?
Yes, we can.
It was just for Jackie, the numbers on appendix B, the subject heading, so we just loaded it in one more column there.
Councillor Lockhart, are you still there?
I am, right?
We got the first part of the question. You were looking for an extra column.
Yes.
Is that in relation to the amounts, in relation to these projects? I assume that's what you might be asking for. What I can confirm is that these projects are now in the new capital programme, but if we're looking for the details of the amounts, I'm sure we can get that for you.
All right, thank you.
So we can, there's, Councillor Ferguson says there's no more speakers. Can we then ask if we can agree that report? Agree, great, thank you. So moving on to the next item. And that's item number 5. And that's the Capital Budget Monitoring 2021-2022 Housing Capital Programme. And that's pages number 13 to 18. Can I hand over to Jackie Taylor again? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. So we're still in the old financial year, but this time this paper is around the Housing Capital Programme. So as I mentioned before, this relates to capital expenditure, but around the service that looks after our council houses. Again, if I take you to section 4 of the report, it summarises that the budget for last year was £79.6 million, and we spent just under £73.2 million. So that was a position that was about £6.5 million less than the budget for the year. Now, what I should have pointed out in the last paper, as well as this paper, it's not unusual for delays in capital projects to materialise, particularly over the last couple of years when we've been facing delays and issues around the pandemic. We do cover at section 4.2 that part of the reason of the underspend was in the new housing supply programme, and that was in relation to the volume of buybacks, which was lower than targeted levels. At section 4.3, we cover the fact that last year Housing and Technical Resources, who run the housing account, received additional one-off funding of £6.1 million, and that was in relation to renewable heat initiatives, feed-in tariffs, money from land sales, developer contributions and other grants, and that feeds into the overall budget that's available to spend. So taking into account in that year-end underspend of £6.5 million, that means in total, including the new monies that we had in the carry forward, we have a position that we have to take money into the new financial year. And we've assessed how much of that we need in the new financial year, and that's £6.8 million. So at section 4.5, we cover what the additional funding will be and the budget for the new financial year, and that's £66.361 million. And that's a figure that you'll see in the paper that's coming in a couple of agenda items' time on the new housing programme. Now, in relation to the appendices to this report, again, a very similar appendix on page 16 in terms of the funding for the housing capital programme, but slightly different in terms of the nature of funding that funds the capital programme. You can see there that the big figures at the bottom of the bottom part of that table is in relation to, again, prudential borrowing, because we do borrow for our capital programme for housing, but also a figure of just over £19.6 million on a line that's called capital funded from current revenue. And all that means is that we will use some of our revenue budget, so the budget that's for day-to-day spend, in order to pay for some of our capital programme. And that's something that happens quite often in our housing programme. So the rent payers that pay rent for their council houses feed into their revenue budget. That's part of their revenue budget, and we choose to use some of that to enhance and augment our council houses. And then there's a awfully pretty graph on page 17, and what this graph aims to do is show the expenditure profile for the year. It definitely looks better in colour than it does in black and white in the printed version that I've got, but what it attempts to do is show at the start of the year, in the left-hand column per period, how much we expect to spend. As we go through the year, we might revise that estimate, and then our actual position to date. When we go on to the current year paper, you'll see that in a little bit more detail and how it happens through the year. So again, that's a quick summary of the report, and I'm happy to take any questions on that. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up at all requesting to speak.
If there's no questions, do we agree the report? Thank you. Okay, so if we go into item number 6, and that's the capital budget monitoring 2022 to 2023, the General Fund Capital Programme. And these are pages 19 to 38. And if I can hand back to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Chair. So we are back into the current period now, which is good, back into the real world. And this is the first report for today on the current financial year. So this is back to our General Fund Capital Programme. So if you remember, this is about all our spend on infrastructure, on assets that doesn't relate to council houses. So a bit of a background here at section 3. It's the full council that approves our capital programmes, and it was the 23rd of February that the programme for this financial year was formally approved, and that totalled £82.284 million. Now, since the approval of that programme, there has been a number of adjustments to that programme, and they are detailed in section 4.1. So, as I said, 82.284 was the starting position for our programme. Now, there has been a number of adjustments to reflect the budget carried forward from last year, which we covered in the previous paper. Some additional funding that has been received last year that we have to augment the programme by, and projects that have transferred to and from revenue. Now, those adjustments total an increase of £12.948 million, and that then results in a base budget for the year of £95.2 million. A full list of those adjustments are included in Appendix A for your information. So that gets us to our base budget. And then during the year, up to date, we have had further adjustments that have been approved through our Executive Committee. Now, that is something that happens every period, every cycle for the Executive Committee. They will consider any movements in the capital programme. So we're covering a couple of Executive Committees that have taken place since the capital programme was approved. So there's a fair number of adjustments that have been made since the base budget was set. We call these adjustments exceptions, and these exceptions have to get approval by the Executive Committee for the programme, the capital programme, to change. So the revised programme for the year is now £98 million. And that includes these adjustments that I've mentioned, which total a net decrease of £2.861 million. And when we get to the appendices, I'll cover, or at least I'll indicate where those adjustments have been from. There is a fair list. The adjustments, they include additional funding that has come in of £6.4 million, and also some slippage or movement in the programme. Slippage refers to spend that we won't make this year, but we will make either next year or in future years. So there's some slippage around some projects, particularly in the social work department. Section 4.4 of the report covers the spend to date. So we're currently in what we call period 4. We break our year into 13 periods, and this report covers the period up to the 15th of July, which is period 4. All of these reports have previously been to the Executive Committee, so the last Executive Committee received this report and approved the adjustments that I mentioned a second ago. So the position for period 4 is that spend was £8.176 million. So if I take you to the appendices, on page 22 and 23, you can see there the list of adjustments that I referred to earlier to the base programme. So quite a simple summary there with a table on page 23 which shows the areas of the adjustments made, and the main one being that carry forward figure, that unspent element from last year being added on to the base budget. The number of other adjustments include monies that have come from revenue for projects, and noticeably a £2.5 million increase in the programme, and that's to do with investment monies that was approved as part of the revenue budget in relation to footpaths and roads. That spend is classed as capital, so we add it onto our capital programme. When we move on to pages 24 through to 27, that is the detail of the exceptions that I mentioned earlier. So these exceptions, as I mentioned, are approved at each Executive Committee, and they're adjustments to the programme. So we've separated them out into each Executive Committee that's taken place, the first one being the 29th of June. And you can see the nature of the adjustments that we're making. Most, if not all, of the adjustments on page 24 is in relation to additional funding that we've received for a number of different things, and we're adding that on to our programme. If I go over to page 25, it's a similar position. We've received extra money for specific things, like Strathclyde Passenger for Transport, a big chunky number in there, £1.7 million. And that is for specific schemes that we will add to our capital projects. Over on page 26, there are adjustments in relation to education, again with additional funding being brought in. And then at the bottom of that page, you can see in brackets a figure of just under £2.1 million. And that relates to our community alarm replacement programme within social work. Our base budget included an amount of money that actually will be spent over a longer period of time now. So we are slipping. There is slippage in that project, and we will move that £2.07 million into our next year's programme. And then on page 27, a number of other adjustments there, both increasing and decreasing the programme. And again, the bottom item there, which is referred to as Swiss Plus replacement, that is further slippage on a project in relation to the social work system, their IT system. Again, that slippage reflects the timing of spend expected on that replacement system. On page 28 of the report, we have Appendix D. That is just simply a summary of the resources. You can see that in the table at the bottom part of the report. We have each resource and their budget for the year for capital. And what that table does, and you'll see this progress through the year, we're taking us from our base position, that first column, 22-23 budget, and you can see the adjustments that have been made through the Executive Committee there to get us to a revised budget on the right-hand column. On page 29, that's a table that you'll recognise from the first report that I covered. Again, we're showing for each resource and service what their budget is, and importantly on the right-hand column, how much has been spent to date. In that bottom right-hand corner, you can see £8.176 million of spend so far. Page 30 of the report shows the funding for the programme. And you'll recall, I mentioned before, the majority of our funding comes through this prudential borrowing that I mentioned earlier, and also capital grant from the government. And this year is similar to previous years where that's been the case. Now, from page 31, this is where things start to get interesting, and we'll bring in Derek Craig, who will cover some of the more physical side of our capital programme and cover how spend is making and how projects are progressing. Thanks.
I would normally cover the three areas of programme that make up the total capital programme for general services in three appendices. The first of these is usually the build executive summary, so building projects. I would normally concentrate for committee on those that have fallen behind our intended programme. This period we have no projects that have fallen into that category on page 31. And on page 32 there's then what's called the non-build executive summary, so anything that's not actually a building project, it's spend. And we would normally highlight here whether there was any projects falling behind their expected expenditure profile as well. And pleased to say that there's still no projects showing that at this moment in time at period 4. So moving on to page 33 is then the roads executive summary. So again, we would look at whether there was any roads projects that were highlighted to the committee about this being falling behind. And again, at this moment in time, there are no projects falling behind. Happy to take any questions here.
There's no questions from me, Councillor Ferguson.
I have no request to speak.
Perfect, that's great, thank you very much. Is the report agreed?
Agreed.
Super, thank you. I can quite happily go on to the next one if you want. Yeah. So if we look at item number 8. Oh. 7, apologies. Item number 7, and that's the capital budget monitoring 2022-23 housing capital programme, and that's pages 39 to 46. And I'll hand you back over to Jackie again.
Thank you, Chair. So sticking with the current financial year, we have this is our housing capital programme. So this is the spend that relates to our council house service. Again, section 4 of the report summarises the overall position. At section 4.4, we have a programme for the year of £66.361 million. That's the figure that I referred to in the paper previously on the old year. So that is our expected spend for the year. And over on page 40, at 4.5, you can see the spend to the 15th of July was £11.3 million. If I take you to the appendices, we have Appendix A on page 42, which covers the funding for the HRA programme. We have income that you can see there, and as I mentioned last time in the report, that majority of the funding for the housing capital programme is from borrowing and from their revenue budget. By the time we've had a few of these meetings, you'll be fed up with me saying the same thing over and over again. When I take us on to page 43 and Appendix B, again, this is the physical progress on projects, and again, Derek can come in and give us an update there. Thanks.
On page 43, we have what's known as the Housing Capital Programme Executive Summary, so a summary of all the projects that we've got ongoing. And I would normally highlight to the Scrutiny Forum the projects that are behind. And this time you will see there under Projects Behind Programme under Period 4, there are 3 projects behind. And over the page on page 44 we have an explanation of each one of those. So the first one is actually Kirkconnell Drive project. It's an external fabric project, and the reason that's behind the programme is resourcing issues. Basically, the contractor is not going to deliver at this point in time. So we've noted that that's slightly behind where we would expect it to be. And the next two, if I could take them together, they are actually related. The construction industry is suffering badly from being able to find microchip processors, and therefore we are finding it really difficult to get oil supplies in order to keep doing our council-wide, now that's just called council-wide phase 3, phase 4, but it's basically a number of addresses within the overall programme that's expected to be done. So we're falling that behind there because of the lack of supply. Associates.
That's great. Thank you very much. Derek, is there any questions?
Don't see anyone requesting to speak.
Thank you very much. And is the report agreed? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. If we can now take a short 5-minute adjournment. Okay, so it is currently 3 o'clock. If we come back at 5 past, thank you.
Thank you for that. So if we can now move on to item number 8, and that's the revenue budget monitoring 2021 to 22, and they are on pages 47 to 58. And if we can, I'd like to hand over to Jackie Taylor again.
Thank you, Chair. So back into the old financial year, but this run of papers is now focusing on our revenue budget. So this is the spend that we make on day-to-day activities. It can be on things like employee costs, on property costs, on supplies and services. And this is the part of the meeting where the detail that is provided hopefully allows the forum to undertake its scrutiny role around our revenue budget. Lorraine, my colleague here, will cover some of that detail in the coming papers. As I mentioned before, I'm not going to focus too much on the old financial year as that year is finished. The papers are obviously there for your information, and I'm happy to take any questions. But with your permission, what I'll do is I'll run through the covering paper. I'll briefly explain the appendix that's attached here, and as I say, we'll have some time for questions at the end of this paper if there are any. Okay, in terms of the paper and the revenue position for 21-22, there is an overarching COVID implication for last year's spend. We were still very much in the midst of funds that were coming in relation to COVID and spend in relation to the pandemic as well. So for the last two financial years, we've been reporting separately around our COVID spend. And that's reflected in the figures that you can see within the budget monitoring. If you choose to go and look at some of the reports that have been to the Executive Committee and other resource committees on the finances for last year and the year before, you'll see that we do report regularly, or we had reported regularly, around overspends in relation to COVID. And that simply reflected the fact that spend was being made through departments on COVID and the funding was being held centrally. So that's just something to bear in mind if you see old reports around our monitoring. Thankfully, as we've moved into the new financial year, we're much more on a kind of core basis, and we're not having to report separately around COVID spend. But sticking to the old year report, the areas I'd highlight to you from this report that's of interest is probably around section 4 and at 4.2 in the table at table 1, and this is on page 48. You can see there that we're reporting the year-end position as an underspend of £6.1 million. And that's the figure that was left over at the end of the year that was unspent of all of our monies. And that's a position after we have approved some transfers into reserves. Now, what that means is that we're able to identify and ask for approval from the Executive Committee to set aside some monies that perhaps haven't been spent from this financial year, but we know what we're going to spend going forward. And that includes things that perhaps are part of multi-year projects or funding that we've received for specific purposes that we want to make sure is available when we have to incur that spend. I'll cover that in a bit more detail in a second. But going back to table 1, you can see the middle column there that's shaded, that's called year end. You can see there a total of £6.1 million. And what we've done is broken that underspend down over its component parts. So the first line of that table is in relation to what we call the resource position. So this is our services, our resources, core year-end position, and that's £122,000 underspent. And if you think about the extent of the spend that we make across the council and the resources that we have, that's a pretty good position to be in by the end of the year. Now, each of these individual lines, there is more detail in Appendix 2 to give you the background to some of that, and there's also some narrative in this report, in the covering report as well. So in relation to resources, if I take you to section 4.4 and 4.5, there's some narrative there which gives a little bit of background to that underspend. One key point that I'm highlighting here at 4.5 is that the resource position included an underspend from the budget that we provide to the IGB, the Integrated Joint Board, our Health and Social Care Partnership. Now, the Council provides funding to them for services that we delegate to them, and it's our adults and older people services that's delegated to the Health and Social Care Partnership. So within the year, there was an underspend on that core funding that the Council provides to the IGB, and that's allowed to be treated as an overfunding position in year. So technically, the Council have provided too much money to the IGB. Now, in previous years, the IGB has kept any underspend and has contributed it towards their own reserves. But this year, we asked for permission for us to retain that money, and that was set aside to help manage pressures on the other side of social work, children and families, which isn't a delegated service, and it has significant financial pressures within. So that's just something that was a bit out of the ordinary last year. Go back to Table 1. The other lines that are included that contribute towards our underspend for the year include our loan charges, a small amount of £49,000. Loan charges is what we use to describe payments in relation to debt. So that could be our interest payments and any principal repayments of debt that we make. Corporate items is the next line on the table, so £2.8 million of an underspend there. Corporate items relates to other spend that the Council makes that's not specifically against one resource. And it may be in any given year that we have a position where some of the budget that we have might not spend. Now, that particular line includes an element of money that we had in relation to pay award that wasn't made last year and will contribute towards our efforts to meet our pay awards going forward. And then the final line on that table is around council tax, and we underspent by £3.058 million on council tax. Now, underspend is the same as an over-recovery of income. So that's why when we look at section 4.8 of the report, it refers to that over-recovery of income, because council tax is money that we bring in. And that over-recovery relates to an increase in collection of council tax. So our arrears collection was buoyant last year, and it allowed us to have that extra level of income. And also, perhaps surprisingly, there was an underspend in relation to the council tax reduction scheme that is offered. So that benefit that people can access if they are eligible to get that council tax reduction scheme. We underspent in that area. Both of those things contributed to that over-recovery of money. Section 4.9 of the report covers in some small detail around our COVID position for the year, and what that refers to is the fact that we had Scottish Government funding that paid for all of our COVID expenditure. There is money that remains unspent. We received money late in the day, and we have carried that forward in our reserves to help pay for spend in relation to the pandemic this year. Now, I mentioned earlier our transfers to reserves. So section 4.10 covers this in a little bit more detail. So if you remember, our transfers to reserves is something that we get approval for, and it relates to money that we want to set aside for future spend on specific things, perhaps multi-year projects, for example. Quite a substantial level of contribution to reserves that you could see in that paragraph there. Our underspend for the year is after we have transferred £59.9 million of money into our reserves. But what I would point out is that includes money in relation to the pandemic that we are spending this year. For your information, one of the appendix that I'll cover in a second gives you the full details of the money that was transferred to reserves, and you'll get a better picture of what those type of things are. And at 4.12, the reference there to what we're doing with that underspend from last year, that's £6.1 million that was left over from last year's budget. We had asked to be transferred to an earmarked portion of our reserves, and that can be used for our 23-24 revenue budget strategy. So that's the document that we present to Council that says this is our plans for next year's revenue budget. We have pressures in next year's revenue budget, so that element of £6.1 million contributes towards meeting in some way the budget gap that we have for next year. If I take you to the appendices, Some of these appendices you will see regularly throughout the reports to this forum for the rest of the year. Some of them are just specific because they are year-end reports. So on page 51, you can see quite a detailed table, a very detailed table. However, this is a good source of information around what each department is spending. So you can see down the left-hand side of this table, we've got our departments. So under each resource heading, you can see the different departments. And then the figures in the columns to the right show our annual budget, our forecast before we make any transfers to reserves, and then our forecast after we make transfers to the reserves. And this replicates the financial monitoring reports that go to each resource committee. So if you're on a resource committee, you'll start to recognise these terms. On the right-hand side of the table, we start to show our actual position, again, before and after transfers to reserves. When we move over to page 52, in Appendix 2, this isn't a regular appendix, this is just a little bit more information on how we ended up with the year-end position and our budgets. And then probably of most interest is from page 54 to page 56. And these are details of the transfers that have been made to reserves. And we've broken this down into two parts. There are transfers to reserves that were approved as part of probable. We've entitled this page. Now, what that refers to is something called our probable outturn exercise. That takes place round about the turn of the year, round about Christmas time, January. We will report to committee on an exercise called our probable outturn exercise. And that is a detailed deep dive into all of our budgets and gives an early year-end expectation of what our position will be. And at that point, we asked for approval to transfer just over £55 million to reserves. So you can start to see some of the details of what those figures are. And if I was to point out some of the kind of big chunkier numbers, you can see on page 54, under probably halfway down that page, you can see in relation to education resources, because these are broken down over resources, you can see £3.5 million, and that's in relation to pupil equity fund. So that's specific funding that schools have responsibility for spending, but we spend it over the school term rather than the financial year. So there's always a chunk of that money that we have to carry forward to spend in the new financial year. On the line below that, we've got just under £2.8 million that's in relation to early years 1140. Now, what that is again a specific grant that we are given that helps pay for the expansion in the hours that people are entitled to for nursery care. The 1140 refers to the number of hours that these children are entitled to now. So if there's any money unspent around that grant, we carry it forward in our reserve, and that allows us to meet those obligations going forward. I mean, that's a couple of the big chunkier numbers that are included within that list. On page 55, there's an amount of COVID funding of £15.6 million that we carried forward into the new financial year. On page 56, there are additional contributions to reserves that happened at the end of the year. Smaller in value than some of those ones I've mentioned before, but again, they're all detailed there for you. The last part of this report is on page 57. This relates to our housing revenue account. So this is our day-to-day spend, but in relation to our council house services. Again, this format is what you will see in our resource committee reports, financial monitoring reports, this tabular form. And you can see bottom right-hand figure of the numbers. You can see a 0, which indicates that we are breaking even at the moment for our housing revenue account. We also provide some explanations to any significant variances in any of the expenditure lines. So we cover our expenditure lines around what we call subjective headings, so employee costs, property costs, supplies and services, and the like. So that's a not so whistle-stop tour through our old year financial monitoring, but again, happy to take any questions on that. Thanks, Chair.
Are there any questions?
don't see anyone in the request to speak list, but maybe just give it a minute just to, in case anyone comes in. No, no requests.
No, thank you very much. Is the report agreed? Thank you very much. If we move on to item number 9, and that is the revenue budget monitoring 2021 to 2022, detailed resource analysis. They are on pages 59 to 142. If I can hand over to Lorraine O'Hagan, please.
Sorry, Chair, I'm going to take this report for the apologies. Lorraine and I have made a very quick change at the last minute there. And the reason I'm going to take this report is simply to say that this is the part of the meeting where I would suggest that we don't have to focus too much on this particular detailed paper, with your permission. What this detailed resource analysis does is provide what we call our trends analysis. And we will cover this in detail for the new year financial report. But what the appendices do from page 61 onwards is really give almost a line-by-line position for each of our resources and each of the lines of spend. We give details and explanations on the variances. Now, again, just simply because this relates to the old financial year, which is now in the past, I wouldn't suggest going through these in any great detail, but I will, of course, I'm happy to take any questions on that, if that's okay, Chair. Thank you.
That's absolutely perfectly fine, thank you. Are there any questions?
No questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So is that report agreed? Super, thank you. Okay, if we go into item number 10 now, and that's the revenue budget monitoring 2022-2023, and on pages 143 to 148. Hand over to Jackie.
Thank you, Chair. So we're back into the current financial year. This is our revenue budget monitoring report. So this is a much more regular, normal style of report that you will see coming to each of these forums. This report covers the time period up to the 15th of July, so period 4 in our financial year. So relatively early in the financial year at the moment. Section 4 of this report gives a position in relation to our general services. General services is another term for our spend that the council makes, which is not housing. So we have our housing programme, our housing revenue account and our general services. So at the 15th of July, we are reporting for the general services budget an underspend of £362,000. That's made up of a number of variances, relatively small across all resources. The majority of the underspend lies within our social work resources, our adults and older people services, and that's as a result of vacancies in our staffing across social workers, daycare, residential homes. Now, you'll recall I mentioned in the last paper that our adults and older people services are part of our health and social care partnership. We delegate the services and the budget to the Integrated Joint Board. So whilst that's an underspend that's appearing in our books, it is part of their delegated budget. If I was to exclude that, our remaining services and resources would have a small overspend of £45,000. Not surprisingly, we've covered at section 4.2 of the report a reference to inflationary and budget pressures. As everybody in the country is facing, the council is also facing some pressures, and we've reported these through our budget strategy report that's been to council. We're experiencing exceptional cost increases around a number of areas: utilities, fuel, transport costs, food costs, and contracts that are subject to inflation, such as our PPP and our waste contracts. PPP is the contract that we have in relation to the build and running of our secondary schools. There's also continued additional costs in our children and family services within social work and also in education in relation to greater numbers of children that are accommodated in external accommodation. So this is children that require social work intervention and require to be placed in external accommodation. That's extremely expensive for each placement. So as part of the year-end financial report, which I just covered a second ago, we did set aside in our reserves our COVID funding that we received last year that had been unspent. And what that has allowed us to do is allocate that £15.6 million to meet some of these pressures this financial year. So we'll take that money from our reserves and we've included it within resource budgets now. We also make reference there at section 4.2.3 to children and families and the ongoing pressures that we're seeing into this financial year. We have had reserves that we set aside that could help pay for that. I mentioned the money that we'd kept from the IJB budget, and there's also been specific reserves that was held from previous years to help pay for that. So that's contributing towards the pressures in children and families this year. Now, one point I would make is that use of reserves is like using cash out of your wallet or out of your purse. You can only use it once. It's not a recurring source of funding. So whilst for 22-23 we'll manage these pressures in children and families, it is something that we are looking at going forward and trying to estimate what our pressures will be going forward. Section 4.3 covers areas of underspend that we're seeing at the moment, and predominantly what we want to focus on here is employee costs. We are seeing a level of underspend in our employee costs across all services of around about £1.5 million at the moment. And that really reflects the difficulties that we're having, and it's not a council-only problem. I believe that across a number of businesses and jobs across the country, there are difficulties in terms of recruiting and retaining staff. That includes things like facilities drivers, mechanics, environmental health officers, a number of roles that it's difficult. It's a challenging, tight labour market that's out there. So whilst every effort's being made to recruit, it's unlikely that that current level of underspend would be reversed. And that's just something to note. There are other pressures that services are facing, so some of that underspend will of course be used to meet some of that, and that will include things like unresolved pay awards going forward. At section 435, we mention adults and older people. So we've already covered the fact that that's a delegated budget to our Health and Social Care Partnership. But one point I would like to make is that we do expect to see further underspends in that service. And that relates to a number of new funding streams that have come in that hasn't yet been either fully committed or recruitment is still to take place across services. So that'd be something that you would see reported back to future meetings. Section 5 covers the housing revenue account. So this is our council house, as you'll recall, and relatively short reference there to report that things are looking good there and we're breaking even. So quick run through the appendices. On page 146, we have that detailed table that shows spend over our resources and services. And then there's a very similar looking table on page 147, which shows the same information but over these subjective headings that I mentioned before. So rather than over departments, it's showing it over the types of spend, like employee costs, like property costs. So a good bit of information there for you at that level. And then on page 148, we have our housing revenue account position. And again, I'll point to that bottom right-hand figure that shows a break-even position. So that's the high-level summary for the budget monitoring. The report that will come next will have a much more detailed analysis of that spend. But I'm happy to take any questions on paper 10 at the moment. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think just slightly froze from me. I think we do have any questions.
Do we have Councillor Mars wishing to speak?
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm referring to paragraph 4.2.1 on page 143 of the pack, this item. I'm wondering, in referring to the PPP costs, which I'm aware of the original bill costs for those were in the region of £318 million. What proportion of our education budget is going out in PPP charges currently, and the predicted position over current and future years in relation to the impact of inflation on that? If you could also direct me to the point on the paper where the total cost is detailed, because I know that loan charges of 35 million is noted, but I'm unsure whether that's referring to PPP holding or additional loan charges in terms of other potential borrowing.
Thanks, Julia. I'm not able to give you a percentage off the top of my head, just simply because I don't have a calculator in my brain, but what I can tell you is the payment for PPP, I believe, is around about £36 million. Lorraine is very quickly checking the trends for me. £38 million, Lorraine's telling me. And what we will see in the next paper, Julia, is on our trend statement, there is a specific line within education where that spend is made. It's not part of our loan charges figure. It's separate because it's not part of the council's borrowing as such, which the loan charges cover. So it's about £38 million, and if I have to look at the total, £380 million of spend, roughly, in education. Now, what I would say, though, is that we get some specific funding that helps us pay for those PPP costs, called level playing field support, which is around about £11 million. So that contributes towards the costs of those. In terms of what that will cost going forward, in terms of that payment, that contract is subject to RPI increases. And one of the areas we were pointing to in our budget strategy that went to full council in June was the fact that our contracts that have an inflationary uplift will obviously be subject to the high levels of inflation that we're seeing at the moment. So whilst I can't predict what the future year's inflation figures will be, it will be subject to an inflationary uplift.
With your indulgence, Chair, if I could add an additional point, I'm assuming that the thank you, Chair. I'm assuming the current RPI is in the region of about 4 times what it was in a lot of the years for this contract. That now if the RPI was in the region of about 3%, I'm sure it will be 4 times or that or higher now. That is an enormous amount of money. Do we have can we have a briefing going forward of what the charges are going to look at, and given that you've had large amounts of money involved, what the plan is going forward to mitigate that?
That plan is part of the council's budget strategy paper, which we took in June, so I can provide that because that gives information around what that estimate is. How we deal with it is the same way that we will have to deal with all the other pressures that the council has. It forms part of our overall strategy, and we have to look at what that budget gap is and what the options are that are open to us. And that process happens from June through to when we have to set the budget in February. So I'm happy to share that paper. It's probably a good base paper for this forum to have around that particular issue and also the other financial pressures that the council has.
No further questions?
That's great, thank you very much. Is that paper agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Going on to item number 11 now. And that's the revenue budget monitoring 2021 to 2022, detailed resource analysis, and they're on pages 149 to 198. And if we could hand over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you, Chair.
Good afternoon, Forum. Agenda item 11 then looks, as Jackie mentioned before, at the same information that you've had in terms of the monitoring position to the end of period 4, but it gives you in a much more detailed level to allow you to scrutinise it at your leisure. So in terms of the report itself, page 149, we've got the background section there, and I'm just aware that there's some new members to the Forum, so I'll just try and take you through the different elements of the papers that we've got ahead of us. So for each of the individual resources and for the housing revenue account, we will show you an executive summary, which is the top level position in terms of the spend and the estimate to date for each of the resources and for each of the services within the resource. We'll also give you a narrative paper for each of the resources and for the housing revenue account, which will highlight for you the most significant variances within the resource, again at the same accounting period, period 4. And then finally, there is a line-by-line trend analysis, which we were looking at just there in terms of pulling the information out for Councillor Mars. So you can see it on a subjective level in terms of the spend across the resources and the housing revenue account. And that's subjectively, as Jackie had explained earlier, that really means we're going down to the level of employee costs, property costs, supplies and services, etc., but also the individual lines within all of those spend areas. So in employee costs, we'll have basic pay, we could have superannuation, we could have overtime costs, other employee costs. Then when you get into property, you can have rates, rent, electricity, gas. So again, it's a very granular level of detail. I wouldn't go through the trend statements in detail. They're there as backup, because what we've done from our professional perspective is we've pulled out the most significant variances that we think are relevant to highlight to yourselves. But obviously they're there for you to peruse, and if you've got any particular questions, we can try to answer them this afternoon. So if I can take you on to the first resource then, we always do this alphabetically, so it's Community and Enterprise Resources. And on page 151, you can see the position for the resource as at accounting period 4. So in the middle of your screen, you have a greyed out box that shows you the annual budget for the year, the forecast for the year, and any variance. Now that's sitting at a 0 variance at the moment because, as Jackie mentioned earlier, we haven't carried out our formal probable outturn exercise yet, and when we do that, that box will be populated in terms of the forecast variance. So you can see the individual lines across each of the services, and in the white section of the paper on the right-hand side, again, you can see the budget proportion to the 15th of July, the actual to the 15th of July, and then the variance. So for Community and Enterprise Resources, the bottom right-hand corner shows you they had an overspend of 45,000. If I can take you over to the narrative explanations then, which is really cutting the budget and the spend up in a slightly different way, and I'll take you through the subjectives. And Chair, if you'll indulge me again, we are still sitting with another 50 pages, so I will highlight the main variances, the more significant variances, I suppose. And what we'll do moving forward then for the forum as we go through the year, we will highlight the new variances that come up every period. So this first one then, page 152, the top variance there, we have an employee cost underspend of 484,000. So we have 682 of an underspend in APTC basic and superannuation, which is mainly due to vacant posts, which the resource are progressing. And that's offset by an overspend in overtime, which is mainly within waste services, and that's due to high staff absences and vehicle availability due to outstanding repairs. If I can take you over the page to page 153, we have the first line there at the top of the page again, and that's within property costs, and we have an electricity contract overspend there, mainly due to higher than anticipated electricity costs for electrical vehicle charging points. In the middle of that page, within transport and plant, another significant variance there is within the fleet service, and that looks at repairs, and that's mainly due to the timing of efficiencies that are being achieved within the fleet service, and that's been managed within the overall resource position. And then the other more sizable variance I would pick up is on page 154, and that's recharges for other departments of the authority, and it's within the road service, and that's really reflecting the current level of income from the routine maintenance and lighting reactive maintenance service, which is less than anticipated as at the end of period 4. And that's all I would pick up on for Community and Enterprise Resources, but I would say that the trends there from page 155 through to 158 are there for your information, and that's really where we pull the high-level narrative from. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Are there any questions?
No questions.
And is the report agreed?
I'll just continue on, Chair.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Appendix B then, page 159, takes us on to the second resource then, which is education resources. So again, you've got the greyed out box in the middle showing no variance at this point in the year, and also far right hand side, again for education, no variance as at period 4. So again, the narrative explanations start on page 160. Employee costs, top line, showing an underspend there within basic superannuation and national insurance, and that's within the early years service. So it's mainly relating to early years posts and as the result of staff turnover and due to the timing of recruitment. Middle of the page within transport and plant, we have people transport, Strathclyde passenger transport, 153,000 of an overspend there. The resource are noting is very much a demand-less service and reflects the volume of children requiring mainstream transport to school and just generally increased cost of that service as well. The final variance on that page is independent school places. We're showing a 277,000 overspend there. That's reflecting the increased cost of placements for pupils with additional support needs and is due to both an increase in the number of places and the actual cost of the placements themselves. And over the page, on page 161, on the income side, we have an over-recovery of income in relation to early years fees, and that's just relating to the increased uptake of available nursery places beyond 1140 hours, which we have available then to sell on, if you like. And that's all I would highlight for education resources. Thanks, Chair.
Ask you, is there any questions?
No questions.
Okay.
Okay,
That's
I'll
fine,
continue on to finance and corporate then, thanks. So that starts on page 167. Again, you've got the greyed out box in the middle for the forecast, which will populate later in the year. And on the right-hand side, well, you can see variances across the services. Bottom line, we're showing a nil variance for the resource at the end of period 4, which is again the middle of July. The variance explanations start on page 168. At the top of the page there, again, we have an underspend within employee costs, £267,000. Part of it relates to finance transactions in terms of vacant posts, which they are recruiting for, and part of it is in relation to personnel services and reflects the timing of employability and funded projects. In the middle of the page, computer equipment maintenance. We've got an overspend there in IT services, and that relates to the cost of IT contracts in relation to software licences and also the associated costs of the new cloud hosting service, which is the transition from the cared service. So we will be looking to do a bit of realignment within our budget as that settles down over the next few months. And I think in terms of significant variances, that's all I would highlight for finance and corporate. Thanks, Chair.
That's good. Is there any questions?
No questions, Chair.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
Move on.
Thank you. Housing and technical resources then is our next resource, and that starts on page 175. Again, no forecast to note at this point, and again, for the resource at period 4, we have no variance at the middle of July. Page 175 gives us the narrative in terms of variances. So again, in terms of employee costs at the top of that page, we have an underspend within basic overtime, superannuation and national insurance for APT and C staff, 348,000 within property services, and that relates to vacancies again which are actively being recruited in line with service requirements. The underspend there is offset by an overspend within manual staffing, again within property services, and that reflects the current level of trade operatives and overtime required to meet their service demands. The next line down, we have a service charge overspend within property costs and indeed within property services. That relates to the costs of shopping centre service charges, which are not recoverable from tenants. The next significant variance is in materials, and that's within supplies and services. That's midway down, page 176. A £627,000 underspend there within property services, and that's reflecting the fact that material costs vary depending on the current workload demands and the timing of works on a number of capital and revenue projects that the resource carry out. And at the bottom of that page, another sizeable variance, payments to contractors, again within property services, £601,000. And again, that's reflecting just the varying demands of workload dependent on the timing of works and the type of works that they're carrying out and whether it's revenue or capital. The next sizeable variance, and the last one for the resource, is in terms of income, and that is in the recovery of capital or recharges from other departments of the authority, and that's really reflecting the underspends I was mentioning in terms of the materials and payments to private contractors, and that's the under recovery that is the offset of that underspend. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any questions?
No questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. The next area we would look at is the housing revenue account. Now that's on page 183, and the trends for the HRA follow afterwards. As Jackie mentioned previously, there was a nil variance. It was a break-even for the housing revenue account, and there is really nothing to note of any size in terms of individual variances. We do have a slight underspend in electricity contract, but that's offset by some small overspends elsewhere. So there's nothing really to highlight in the housing revenue account at period 4. Thanks, Chair.
Beth, any questions?
No questions.
No questions. That's great. We move on.
Okay, the final resource then is social work resources, and that starts on page 189. As Jackie had mentioned earlier, we're showing an underspend there, £407,000, and that's mainly all lying within adults and older people, with a couple of offsetting variances within the other services of the resource. Page 190 starts the variance explanations. So the very first one, employee costs, we're showing £600,000 of an underspend there. We have an underspend within admin and clerical staff as a result of vacancies, which they are recruiting for. We have an overspend there within managerial support specialists, and that's turnover in that particular area being less than anticipated, and also some overtime being incurred. At the bottom of that page, basic grade social workers, again, a sizeable underspend there within children, families and adults and older people, both of which are a result of vacancies, which again they are actively recruiting for. In terms of more sizeable variances, if I can take you down to page 191 at the bottom of that page, within payments to contractors, we have an overspend, long-term care, and that's within children and families, and that's the result of the continuing requirement for children's residential placements within external schools. The next variances to highlight really are on the income side, and that's on page 192. Fees and charges general shows an under recovery there within adults and older people. In responding to COVID-19, services in the community are still working at reduced capacity, and therefore service user charges have been adjusted to reflect the services being delivered, which has meant we have an under recovery of income. And the final one, charges to health boards, we have an over recovery there, and that reflects funding for the loss of income as a result of the response to COVID-19. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, and is there any questions?
No questions, Chair.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think we can is that report agreed? That's great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Lorraine. And if we move on to item number 12, if there's any other items of urgent business. I've got nothing.
No hand raised.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much. I would just like to thank everybody who's attended the meeting today. Thank you for your time and your attendance, and the meeting is now closed.